So this morning I'm going to focus on an enduring international security problem, which is probably quite familiar to most people in this room, and that's the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technology around the globe. Since the first nuclear energy renaissance, it's been obvious, especially to many of you, that countries capable of enriching uranium or reprocessing plutonium from spent reactor fuel can make the fissile material needed for a nuclear device. Now, the key problem is that the non-proliferation treaty regime, of course, doesn't permit states, or doesn't bar states from developing this technology so long as they implement the proper safeguards for peaceful use. Now, the United States has therefore pursued a number of additional measures over the decades to inhibit countries from surmounting this technical choke point to the bomb. Indeed, the last two presidential administrations in particular have made it a priority to erect new barriers to the development of this so-called E&R technology. So in 2004, President Bush made a speech to NEU in which he called into question the basic legal right of states to develop E&R technology. Bush argued that states that didn't already have what he referred to as legally operating commercial E&R facilities should be prevented from developing this technology by the Nuclear Suppliers Group. Now, this global approach somewhat withered on the vine over the years, so the Obama administration adopted a more bilateral approach. The White House argued that U.S. nuclear cooperation agreements should be conditioned on the recipient country forswearing their right to enrichment or processing technology. So by baking these sort of strict conditions into so-called 123 agreements, this is supposed to usher in a new gold standard, if you will, of non-proliferation, especially after the UAE finalized such a 123 agreement. But the White House found it difficult to convince Vietnam and Jordan, not to mention South Korea, to follow suit. So what's the best path forward in terms of trying to limit the spread of this technology? My main argument here this morning is that the U.S. should make countries an offer they can't refuse. The next presidential administration should be willing to offer other states, particularly our allies, substantial packages of economic and military assistance in return for binding pledges to forego the development of E&R technology. So to use a more pejorative and value-laden phrase, I think the U.S. should bribe countries into giving up their right to this sensitive nuclear technology. Now, to be sure, this sort of transactional approach is not going to work with every country. Some allies might not be willing to trade away nuclear programs that have this sort of technology, and it may be difficult to find the right mix of quids and quos to strike a deal. So the key question I'm going to examine here this morning is why and when should the U.S. bargain with countries to buy out their demand for E&R technology? I'm going to provide an answer over the next 20-30 minutes in about three parts. So first, I make the case that many countries are quite keen on accepting nuclear buyouts and often play up the threat of proliferation to pressure more rewards from Washington. Some even retain the option to go down this pathway precisely because they know they can use it to try and extract large packages from DC. But some are much better at cutting deals than others. So in the second part, I'm going to lay out a framework for explaining this track record of success and failure. When it comes to compelling concessions from Washington, my central argument is that there's an optimal amount of nuclear technology, a sort of sweet spot or a Goldilocks zone, if you will, that puts the country in the best position to strike a bargain. I'm then going to use these findings to circle back and pinpoint when U.S. policy practitioners should bribe countries into giving up enrichment and reprocessing programs. Any questions on where we're going over the next 30 minutes? So let me turn to the first foundational claim of my talk. That's that bribery, if you will, is a pragmatic strategy precisely because countries often use nuclear programs to try and compel concessions from Washington. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that this is the single reason that countries start or stop a civil or military nuclear weapons program in the first place, but it is possible to derive side benefits as a country develops a program. Indeed, if we look back over the last 70 years of nuclear diplomacy, It's clear that both adversaries and allies alike have used the threat of proliferation to try and extract the biggest possible buyout from Washington. Let's start with the Cold War. Starting with bids by the West Germans and the Italians to gain a bigger foothold during the formative years of NATO, through the 1960s, when U.S. officials found themselves negotiating a basic quid pro quo with the Japanese over the future of their civil nuclear program in the late 1960s and the terms for territorial reversion of Okinawa. Several years later, the South Koreans essentially mobilized a nuclear weapons program from scratch in 1970 to try and back demands for greater U.S. military commitment to their security. And towards the end of the decade, in the 1970s, Pakistani officials quietly let the Carter administration know that they might forego the bomb if Washington was willing to provide them with a formal treaty alliance, similar to what we offered NATO and our East Asian allies at the time. Now, officials in the Beltway were well aware of what was going on at the time. So if you look at this recently declassified intelligence assessment from 1975, you can see that the CIA wagered with near certainty that states would exploit their threshold position, that is, being close to being able to produce the bomb, rather than actual weapons capabilities. Indeed, as the Cold War ended, the North Koreans in the early 1990s used their emerging plutonium program to try and extract a large economic and political package from DC. By the end of the decade, there was inklings that the Libyans were interested in starting to trade away their stagnated enrichment program. And in 2003, Iran embarked on a 12-year odyssey of nuclear negotiations punctuated by outright defiance, which culminated, of course, in the nuclear deal in July. Over the last year, most interestingly, Saudi Arabia appears to have taken a page out of the old South Korean playbook by basically conjuring up an empty proliferation threat to try and pressure Washington for enhanced security guarantees. So given the time and resources required to develop either a civil or military program that's really viable, I think it should come as no surprise that governments often seek to extract side benefits along the way. Now, to be clear, as I mentioned at the outset, there's other important drivers that push countries to want to seek actual nuclear weapons or nuclear energy in the first place, but it is possible to pursue multiple objectives over the lifespan of a nuclear program, especially if it's going on for many decades. Now, the U.S. is inclined to try and find a diplomatic solution whenever confronted with this sort of bargain or threat. For Washington, the calculus is quite simple. Buying out a country's nuclear ambitions and or technology is less costly than preventive war and far more effective than peer containment. Furthermore, invading or abandoning an ally, in particular, is really never pragmatic when it comes to trying to achieve the goal of nuclear non-proliferation. But the U.S. doesn't automatically bribe away every threat that pops up or cut a deal whenever a country is willing to bargain over the future of its nuclear program. So some countries are quite successful at getting Washington to provide them with goodies in exchange for some sort of commitment over the future of their nuclear program, while others fail to get much at all and often end up in a worse position. So when it comes to cutting a deal, my central argument here today is that there's an optimal amount of nuclear technology for the challenger, or the other country, if you will, what I refer to as this Goldilocks Zone in the middle. The crux of the issue is that a country must have enough capability, enough nuclear infrastructure in place to put a real threat of proliferation on the table, while still being able at the same time to walk that threat back and make a credible non-proliferation promise once the U.S. complies with whatever demands they've placed on the bargaining table. So as you can see from this simple table, this trade-off between the credibility of threats and assurances creates this Goldilocks zone in the middle for cutting deals with the U.S. So what I've outlined here is essentially a series of technical signposts that we can kind of establish in advance of looking at these cases to scope out where a nuclear program is. And by doing so, we can start to zoom in on some specific cases that I'm going to discuss for the bulk of my talk here today. So with too little technology, the threat to proliferate is simply not believable in the near term. I'm going to discuss Saudi Arabia and South Korea 4 decades ago to drive this key point home. But if a country builds up too much capacity to produce fissile material and nuclear weapons, moving into the red, then it becomes difficult to make a non-proliferation promise for a few key reasons. North Korean behavior during the six-party talks in 2007, I think, is a really good example of this. But I'm also briefly going to discuss some of the challenges that the Iranians ran into over the last 5 years with their nuclear program as it continued to advance. Now, the U.S. is inclined to comply with very expensive demands when a country brings just the right amount of nuclear technology to the bargaining table, as North Korea was able to do in the early 1990s. I'm going to focus mostly on North Korea, but I'm happy to discuss Japan's bargain that it made in the late 1960s and early 1970s in the Q&A. So let's move on to my first key point, which is that if a country doesn't have the ability to produce fissile material, the threat to proliferate is simply not credible. Let's walk through this with Saudi Arabia. So over the last year, the Saudis have been pretty effective at stoking a persistent fear in Washington that the Iran deal is going to sort of spark an atomic chain reaction in the Middle East. High-ranking Saudi officials have promised to match Iran's enrichment capacity and claim that, quote, all options are on the table, end quote, as the kingdom confronts Iran in a regional power struggle. Now, these not-so-veiled threats to either acquire enrichment and or proliferate have been timed to pretty precisely coincide with demands during alliance consultations with U.S. officials. So this sort of bargaining stratagem, I think, was most vividly displayed in May as Saudi officials prepared to meet with President Obama at the White House in Camp David. In preparation for this major summit meeting, the Saudis made their expectations clear. The New York Times reported that the Saudis wanted a formal defense treaty with the U.S. pledging to defend them if they came under external attack. This demand for a formal treaty alliance and enhanced military assistance came on the heels of several public threats to match Iranian enrichment capabilities. Now, the key weakness with the Saudi ruse, of course, is that the kingdom lacks the technical means to really follow through on this threat in the near term. The Saudis have several small research facilities, but no ability to actually produce the fissile material that will go into a nuclear weapon. Even if Saudi Arabia spent enough to develop this sort of enrichment capacity over the next 5 to 10 years, this doesn't really give them much leverage as they're negotiating with U.S. officials in real time for enhanced reassurances. Some have suggested that this threat is actually quite salient because the Saudis could call in a favor to Pakistan, since the kingdom allegedly financed Islamabad's nuclear weapons program. Now, the problem is that right now, Pakistan really wants to emulate India by proving it's a responsible nuclear power on the global stage, and it seeks to gain entry into the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And of course, the Nuclear Suppliers Group has pledged not to export sensitive fuel cycle technology to the Middle East. So speculation always abounds over the true nature of the Saudi-Pak connection, but regardless of whatever that contract may be, it's certainly not going to help the Saudis today in jump-starting an enrichment program in the coming months at least. So the White House ended up calling the Saudi nuclear bluff, quite simply because they didn't have the technology to follow through. After the May 2015 Camp David summit, President Obama reassured the Saudis that our commitment to them was, quote, ironclad, but he stopped short of offering a formal defense pact. Instead, we offered some low-cost, pragmatic, concrete deliverables that fell well short of what the Saudis had requested. We gave them military materials and assistance to help the Saudis build up their own internal defenses, but this wasn't anywhere near to the sort of advanced quality, the advanced military equipment that the Saudis have been asking for. U.S. officials seem to know that it made sense to provide the Saudis with some sort of take-home deliverables rather than send them packing and wait until they put a real nuclear option on the table. So beyond just rebuffing demands, though, Washington can most effectively stop a nuclear weapons program if a country threatens proliferation before it has the technical building blocks in place. So in the 1970s, these sort of premature threats from South Korea provided U.S. officials with a really prime opportunity to dissuade and deny the development of sensitive nuclear technology. At the time, Seoul was shocked by the Nixon administration's decision to withdraw an entire division of U.S. military forces from Korea. President Park, pictured here, appears to have concluded that he couldn't reverse this sort of strategic realignment on the peninsula, but he needed to develop a nuclear trump card, if you will, to play in case the U.S. tried to withdraw more materials or physical support from the peninsula. South Korea at the time had put in place plans to develop a full civil nuclear fuel cycle, similar to Japan, and so President Park added an explicit military dimension to these plans by creating 2 new defense agencies in 1970. Now the problem is that, much like Saudi Arabia, aside from a small research reactor, South Korea had no major nuclear infrastructure or ability to produce fissile material at the time. Park mobilized a massive effort to get the technical building blocks in place as quickly as possible. Now these efforts started to come to fruition by 1974 when Seoul secured a major contract for a nuclear reactor and reprocessing facility from several European firms. But the problem is that the Europeans hadn't actually provided these turnkey facilities yet. And at the same time, these efforts to secure the back end of the fuel cycle sounded a major alarm in Washington that South Korea might be trying to at least acquire a nuclear weapons option. So there's a trove of recently declassified cables and memos from the U.S. policy and intelligence community, which really goes through in minute detail how U.S. officials believed they had a very good chance to slow down and indeed stop the South Korean effort to acquire this technology by inhibiting their access to sensitive technology and mounting a major diplomatic campaign that involved a series of very explicit protests or demarches over the nuclear issue. So Park tried to play his hand on several occasions throughout 1975 by making numerous threats in public and in private, tied to requests for greater U.S. assistance and military commitment to Seoul. But this nuclear bluff proved to be quite counterproductive as U.S. officials ramped up pressure on the South Koreans to cancel the contract that they had with the European firms to provide this turnkey technology. Indeed, as the South Koreans resisted canceling the contract with the French, the Ford administration authorized what to date has been the strongest démarche ever issued to Seoul, in which the Ford administration threatened to review the quote, whole range of security and political relationships with Seoul if they continued course. In reaction, President Park agreed to cancel the contract for the reprocessing facility, leaving South Korea without the ability to really follow through on this threat to strike on their own and field an independent nuclear force. So the take-home point by looking at Saudi Arabia and South Korea is that neither of these countries had the infrastructure in place to put enough pressure on the U.S. to comply with what were considered to be expensive demands. In the Saudi case, they wanted a formal treaty commitment, and in the South Korean case, they wanted more troops and support. Instead of extracting concessions from Washington, both countries made it more difficult to procure sensitive technology by essentially announcing possible intent to proliferate. The lesson is pretty straightforward. If you want a big bribe from Washington, don't play the nuclear card unless you can actually make the bomb. So if nuclear bluffs are counterproductive, then perhaps the country should move closer to the bomb to extract the biggest possible concessions from DC. So this seems to make intuitive sense. On initial consideration, if you develop the technology and the capability to be what some refer to as a screwdriver turn away from producing a nuclear weapon, this should put the burden on the U.S. to try and cut a deal before it's too late. And perhaps the U.S. would be willing to provide more concessions precisely to prevent proliferation. Once a country either produces large amounts of fissile material or the capacity to do so on short notice, Washington may offer a bigger payout. But Thomas Schelling reminded us 50 years ago in his classic work on coercive diplomacy that these sort of compelling threats need to be backed with a commitment of restraint. Otherwise, there's really no inducement for the U.S. to comply. The problem is that it becomes increasingly difficult for the challenger to offer such an assurance the closer the country moves towards a nuclear weapons option. The most obvious challenge is that the technical requirements of cutting this sort of deal go up quite a lot. So let's look at the Iranian case over the last 5 years. In 2009, for example, the Iranians met with a U.S. team on the sidelines of a meeting in Geneva to try and negotiate a confidence-building measure. At the time, Iran had about 1,500 kilograms of LEU, along with a centrifuge capacity to enrich the stock further into enough HEU for a single nuclear weapon. The Americans proposed a pretty simple trade. If Iran shipped most of the LEU out of the country, then the U.S. would help them secure a fuel contract for a reactor in Tehran. The Iranians initially accepted this deal, but once they tried to sell it back in Tehran, they were forced to overrule and walk back on this simple confidence-building measure. So after this deadlock in Geneva, the Iranians embarked on a 7-month period of increasing the quantity and disposition of enriched uranium, perhaps in an attempt to put themselves in a better bargaining position. The problem is that by April 2010, the U.S. had put together a pretty serious multinational coalition to try and apply sanctions on the country. The Iranians saw this coming, and they attempted to revive the old October 2009 deal in an attempt to maybe stave off economic punishment. But the problem is that Iran now had close to 2,300 kilograms of LEU, so the original terms were simply not sufficient and would leave them with enough material to produce HEU for an atomic weapon. The Iranians, in essence, had diluted the value of their non-proliferation promise and refused to update the proposal to correct for their technical progress over the last 7 months. Instead of strengthening Iran's hand at the bargaining table, the buildup increased the requirements of cutting a deal and ended up catalyzing harsh multilateral sanctions against the Iranians. Now, to be sure, the July 2015 deal underscores that a country in Iran's position could always meet the non-proliferation requirements laid out by the U.S. if it so desires. After 3 years of enduring sanctions while building up their nuclear program, the Iranian leadership decided to cut an interim nuclear accord in November 2013. While the final agreement, cut over the summer, was based on a set of unprecedented requirements designed to constrain Iran's capacity to produce nuclear weapons, most notably continuous monitoring of their key facilities and all nuclear imports. Since promising restraint at this level of technology requires a country in Iran's position to either give up significant aspects of its nuclear infrastructure or place it under intense verification, the leadership must be willing to pay these costs necessary to cut a deal. The problem is that beyond just the terms of the deal is the domestic price that a country must pay to trade away a mature nuclear weapons program. So consider North Korean behavior during the six-party talks.
I think it's de rigueur to have at least one Kim Jong-il photo per talk here.
I think I might have two, but I think the next is more of a Bob Gallucci close-up. So after the North Koreans produced large amounts of plutonium and ended up testing a nuclear device in October 2006, the U.S. officials eventually came around to offering them a viable plan to disable their nuclear infrastructure in return for phased rewards. The Kim regime started to take some of these initial steps as they pertain to the plutonium program, but eventually decided, when asked to kind of declare all material and all technology within the complex, that the juice simply wasn't worth the squeeze anymore, and refused to implement the rest of the terms. So it seems plausible, especially considering where we are today with the North Koreans, that they always wanted a nuclear deterrent. And so this sort of diplomatic exercise was, a useful way to force them to reveal their true intentions for the bomb. But there's a more nuanced read of the case, if you will. And again, we don't have clear evidence that this happened, but some of the actions that they took at the negotiation table seem to indicate that perhaps there was an influential group of regime elites that became steadily vested in the success of the nuclear program over its many decades of development. Given the model of regime survival in North Korea, the leadership would find it hard and downright risky to trade away what had become probably one of the most valuable commodities for their regime elite. The nub of the issue is that a nuclear program tends to lock in or entrap the leadership of a country over time, especially as it matures into an operational capability. This is because nuclear technology exhibits what economists refer to as a path dependency. Each technical step the nuclear program takes towards the bomb makes it more difficult for the government to reverse course later on or shift that program onto a different track as new bureaucratic and domestic political barriers start to emerge. So, for example, the scientific nuclear complex may become entrenched in the political system over time and seek to retain generous budget outlays year after year, or politicians that manage these operations may accrue power or benefit from having custody over a nuclear program. And as the ultimate customer of nuclear weapons technology, military officers with influence within a country's upper leadership may push for tangible rewards on this very long-term investment. So these sort of domestic coalitions that might form around a nuclear program tend to pressure the government to stay the course as it matures, or at a minimum, not trade away this very valuable nuclear infrastructure. Now, the path-dependent nature of nuclear technology means the leadership will become reluctant to trade away the nuclear program as it matures. The government could always implement the terms of the deal laid out by the US, just as the North Koreans had the option, of course, to live up to the terms that were presented under the February 2007 roadmap. But since the nuclear program generates increasing returns over time, especially as it matures, the leadership finds that it cannot incur the domestic political costs of trading away this valuable asset. So, a country's nuclear program provides the most leverage for bargaining when it brings just the right amount of nuclear technology to the bargaining table. The leadership needs to have enough capability in place so that it can make a real and immediate threat of proliferation, while still retaining the political flexibility to back this threat with a non-proliferation promise. In other words, the country needs to be able to promise the US that if they give up a big package of concessions, that this compliance is going to be rewarded with indefinite nuclear restraint, which is very difficult to do. A country can most readily pull off this mix when the program enters this Goldilocks zone with an emerging capacity to enrich uranium or reprocess plutonium. The key advantage of being in this sort of fissile material sweet spot is that the leadership can lock the emerging nuclear program into a benign or civilian course, rather than having to reverse a mature weapons complex away from the bomb. Now, this holds for both allies and adversaries, autocracies and democracies, and across a wide range of demands based on a number of different motives. For the rest of this talk, I'm only going to focus briefly on North Korea in the early 1990s, but I'm happy to discuss some of the other cases, especially Japan's program, because it kind of comes at this from a very different civilian perspective. So North Korea entered this fissile material sweet spot in 1991 when construction on a reprocessing plant neared completion. After the United States opened up a diplomatic channel to try and resolve this issue, North Korea manipulated the plutonium program on several occasions to try and extract the biggest possible package of concessions from DC. In the most striking instance, North Korea announced it would begin to separate plutonium because Washington had no intention of giving them anything. North Korean officials then started a ticking clock by pointing out that they had moved the reactor fuel into ponds, and that it would take about 2 months to completely unload all the spent reactor fuel before it was reprocessed, leaving more than enough time for the US and North Korea to strike a deal. This explicit brinksmanship indicates that North Korea may have recognized the leverage provided by being in this sort of Goldilocks zone. The ultimatum that the North Koreans made did end up revealing Washington's bottom line, as US officials contemplated taking military action in the summer of '94. Now, before the situation could escalate out of control, the unexpected and unauthorized visit of former US President Carter provided Kim Il-sung with an off-ramp to reach a deal. The US then agreed, as we all know, to buy out North Korea's plutonium program with a package that consisted primarily of $50 million each year in heavy fuel oil, and eventually, if North Korea disabled the entire plutonium program, about $4 billion in 2 modern light water reactors. In return, North Korea agreed to freeze plutonium operations, seal the reprocessing facility for eventual disablement, and ship all spent reactor fuel out of the country. North Korea was able to strike this sort of low-cost and high-reward bargain with the U.S. because their nuclear program was in this Goldilocks zone. In 1994, the U.S. paid North Korea to freeze its operations and basically stay in place, with the expectation that they would disable the plutonium program down the road. This was a very modest price to pay. North Korea avoided military attack and reaped badly needed energy assistance without having to make a really tough decision whether or not they're going to give up their entire nuclear infrastructure. From the North Korean perspective, it probably seemed as though the benefits of the agreed framework far outweighed the cost of cutting a deal. By contrast, the production of plutonium and test of a nuclear device a decade later in the lead-up to the six-party talks forced the North Koreans to contemplate giving up their entire nuclear program in order to cut a much grander bargain with the U.S. So in the final few minutes here, let me connect these findings about the Goldilocks zone back to the policy question I asked at the outset. What's the best path forward for limiting the spread of ENR technology? This is not an abstract historical question. The next presidential administration needs to be prepared to weather a coming storm over the spread of ENR for two simple reasons. First, the traditional supply-side barriers are starting to erode. India, Pakistan, Iran, and North Korea have all mastered the nuclear fuel cycle and remain outside of the nuclear suppliers group. With the exception of India, these countries are unlikely to meet their membership requirements anytime soon. If Pakistan's current bid to join the NSG is rebuffed, for instance, Islamabad has indicated that it may strike out on its own and become an above-board supplier to developing countries. In their words, especially Islamic countries, which is code for Saudi Arabia. Furthermore, there's new manufacturing technologies, such as 3D printing, that are coming down the pipeline that may enable the transfer and production of key dual-use components around the globe. So if these supply-side barriers to ENR start to erode, the problem is that the political demand for this technology may increase independent of a country's nuclear energy requirements for several reasons. The Iran agreement lays out a path for the international community to accept and legitimize Tehran's pursuit of enrichment. Several U.S. allies that have been models of non-proliferation, especially of the NPT regime, feel as though they should be allowed to pursue the full nuclear fuel cycle without incurring Washington's wrath. On a normative level, mastering enrichment and reprocessing technology may become enshrined as an alluring status symbol, especially after Iran's program is free of restraints in 15 years. And from a deep strategic perspective, countries may believe that retaining this sort of advanced nuclear program will allow them to reap some sort of security or deterrent benefit by hedging without having to pay overt costs of producing nuclear weapons. So given these emerging trends in supply and demand for ENR, the key question for the next presidential administration caught up in the storm is going to be whether the U.S. should bargain with countries, especially our allies, to try and buy out their demand for ENR technology. Should Washington try and entice countries from wanting this technology in the first place by offering rewards? Or should we wait until a country actually acquires this sort of technology before trying to strike a deal? Now, the Goldilocks principle underscores that nuclear bluffs that a country would make with too little technology actually provide Washington with a really prime opportunity. U.S. officials can probe whether modest deliverables could convince the country to forego developing sensitive nuclear technology. So, as the Saudis and South Koreans found out, Washington is going to reject expensive demands precisely because the country doesn't have any real technology to trade away. But U.S. officials can then counter with a cheaper package designed to keep this potential proliferator from ever moving into the Goldilocks zone and surmounting this key technical choke point to the bomb. Now, this does raise an obvious moral hazard. Any ally could essentially summon up a nuclear program from thin air, inflate demands, and then bargain down to a realistic package of reassurance deliverables. The Saudis, for instance, seem to know that requesting a formal treaty pact was simply not a reasonable demand because this would need to be ratified by Congress. So perhaps the Saudi nuclear gambit was actually designed to accomplish more modest objectives, such as boosting the value and quality of U.S. military hardware provided under yet another arms deal, which was recently concluded last month. The U.S., I think, should embrace this sort of moral hazard of buying out these empty nuclear threats, because it will have to spend much more once the country actually surmounts the ENR choke point and moves into the Goldilocks zone. Once a state actually starts to master this technology, U.S. options to stop or delay the country from moving closer to the bomb become quite limited. In the South Korean case, for example, in 1975, the U.S. government really risked the alliance relationship by placing a heavy-handed démarche on the table to keep Seoul out of the Goldilocks zone, because they knew that reversing course once the South Koreans acquired a plutonium program would be quite difficult. So complying with the country's demands in exchange for a binding non-proliferation promise, I think, may be the least worst option, as well as the final chance to cut a deal on the cheap. So to use an analogy, if a nuclear program is akin to a train going down the tracks, the Goldilocks zone may be the last stop for the U.S. to really be able to apply pressure and offer rewards before it becomes too costly or difficult to stop the train or move it onto a civilian course. So to sum up, as the Iran deal underscores, that was recently concluded, it's still possible to reach an agreement at a very high stage of nuclear technology, but it becomes costly and at times impossible to cut a deal as the nuclear program matures into an operational capability. The U.S. must create a situation whereby the price of giving up, or at least reducing some aspect of the nuclear program, is dwarfed by the costs of punishment or foregoing lucrative rewards. In the case of Iran, Washington was able to identify Tehran's vulnerability to the international energy market and apply powerful sanctions to get the Iranians to come back to the table in 2013. With the North Koreans, however, it was simply not possible to entice them away from the bomb once they were locked in. To end on a positive note, though, I think that the next U.S. presidential administration is going to be able to deal with this coming storm of ENR technology if they make allies offers they can't refuse. The list of nuclear-capable U.S. adversaries beyond Iran is paper thin. So if the focus within the non-proliferation community starts to shift back towards U.S. allies, I think it's really important to avoid conflating capability and intent, not to proliferate so much, but rather to play this sort of nuclear bargaining chip with us. In East Asia, the threats made in the 1960s and 1970s are really unthinkable to the current governments in Tokyo and Seoul. Both alliances with the U.S. have matured into healthy relationships, while the political leaders of each country have become steadily locked into civil nuclear energy programs. As a result, Japan and South Korea have the capability, but no intent really, to threaten the U.S. With proliferation. In the Middle East, this is a different story. The Saudis and other anxious nations have clear intent, but lack the capabilities needed to pressure Washington for serious concessions. Since these countries are not yet in the Goldilocks zone, I think we're really facing a key opportunity over the next few years for U.S. officials to be able to prevent the spread of ENR technology in this volatile region by buying out these ambitions over the coming years. So I look forward to discussing the cases and some of these policy prescriptions with you all over the next 45 minutes. Thank you.